My name's Glenna Gannon. I'm getting familiar with my buttons here. I work at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Institute of Natural Resources and Extension. My primary role here is as an assistant research professor. So my focus area is in high latitude agriculture and food systems. Really, my background is in food systems research, but I got pulled into being a researcher for the variety trials back in 2017. And a few years after that, I took them over, and here we are getting close to a decade later. So this has been a staple part of my position here at the university for quite some time. And I will say there's a few caveats as we talk about this. I know a lot of you are joining from Southeast Alaska or South Central Alaska, excuse me. And the biggest caveat here is that a lot of the results are for interior Alaska. So I have some recommendations that we'll be talking about throughout the presentation. I do try and make note of some of the trials that have happened elsewhere and might be good recommendations, but I just want, all of that to be taken with a grain of salt. I'm gonna stop sharing for just a second and see why this is not letting me. Could you guys see all of my tabs when I had that open, or did it look?
There was a browser bar.
Yeah, okay, I was trying to figure out here. Okay, here we go. It wasn't letting me do it while I was already in there. Okay, great. Well, without further ado, I'll get started and talk just a little bit briefly about the background of the variety trials. So the variety trials is actually, I mentioned I've been involved since 2017, but really the agriculture and forestry experiment stations, there used to be 8 of them throughout Alaska, and they were founded on basically the intention to identify what grows well in Alaska. So, that's really the continuing purpose of the variety trials, especially given that we don't have a vegetable breeder or a fruit breeder or anyone of that capacity working in the state, and we haven't for about 40 years now. We do have a couple small grain breeders working. I have a colleague, Jakir Hassan, who's working on some barley and wheat varieties. But other than that, we're kind of left to our own devices here in terms of what is commercially available or available through seed banks and the like. So where the variety trials are conducted, up here in Fairbanks, where I'm located, that's that middle triangle. And then there are some trials replicated at the Matanuska Experiment Station. So some of you might know of that as the MEFIC. And so we have I'd say a subsection of the sub-selection of trials conducted down there. There's things like heat-loving crops like corn and artichokes and things like that that we don't replicate there. I've tried, it's hard. It's honestly not the best use of limited resources. And then in addition to that, we have some select screening trials for berries with a partner farm up in Anaktuvik Pass, which is kind of gone in fits and starts over the last few years, and mostly that's survivability studies. If anyone's got questions about that kind of thing, we can talk about it more later. So why conduct variety trials? I mentioned a little bit in terms of from the breeding perspective, why we do trials, but also in Alaska in particular, we are at the forefront of wholesale environmental changes. So we are already seeing some changes to our growing season. This map from the Garden Helper tool demonstrates some of the changes in the growing season that we've already experienced over the last century, and then what we are likely to see over the next century in terms of our hardiness zone areas. But then throughout the state, we're also seeing a lot more precipitation and more variability in our seasonality. So when we get precipitation and how much, things like that. So reason stands that the things that we used to rely on, so the varieties or crops that we used to think of as our standards for Alaska, those two are changing. And that is really the heart and soul of the variety trials, is to evaluate what we have available to us in terms of genetic material and test it out. So here's that in a nutshell, to test which varieties and cultivars are available to us as they are developed for various climatic conditions or disease or pests resistance, things like that. All right, so getting into the variety trials as they are conducted today at the experiment station and how I operate them. People often ask me, how do you decide what to trial? The answer is it's really hard, but every 2 years I do launch a stakeholder survey. This goes out to people on the Cooperative Extension listserv, oftentimes folks like my friends at the Soil and Water Conservation Districts help me get this out. It's sort of like wherever I can spread the word. A link is sent out and I get input. Usually the response rate is about 3/4 of the responses are from home gardeners, which is great. The variety trials are really targeted. My stakeholders are anyone who grows stuff in Alaska. So I really do try and write the results up so that they're meaningful to, say, a small scale farm or a producer, but also so that it's digestible and useful information for our home gardener, anyone from a beginner to a farm operation. So this is just to give you a sense of what's been requested by the top 10s have been requested by the general public over the last 3 years. And to follow, this is the response to those requests. This is over the last 5 years, what has gone into the trials. So as you can see here, we've continued to grow the trials here at the Fairbanks farm. And I will just reiterate that this reflects all of the crops selected for the Fairbanks farm. And again, it's a subset of these. They get trialed in Palmer. Okay, just a quick note before I dive into the results and what you guys can start thinking about and asking me questions about in terms of recommendations, because I know that's usually what folks are most interested in, is where this information is housed once we do the research. So every year there is a report, an annual report that comes out. It is housed. There will be a link at the end of the presentation. I tell people the easiest way to find this is just to Google UAF variety trials. That'll get you there in 1 or 2 clicks. But these PDFs are available for free for people to download. I will mention we had some issues with our formatting, and I identified a couple data issues from 2023. So right now we're up to 2021, and as soon as we get some bugs fixed for 22 and 23, those will be back up, and 2024 is forthcoming. You guys are actually going to be the first to get some sneak peeks at the 2024 variety trial results tonight. So that report should be out within a month. Okay, so getting into results, there's going to be a lot of pictures and a lot of data. I did share a PDF version of the slides with Monica, so she can share those with folks at the end if anyone's interested. And then you'll also have my email at the end to ask questions. So don't feel like you have to take down every single note or take pictures of everything. Hopefully we got you covered. So I'm going to just go through some crops. This won't be everything that's been trialed, but it'll be a lot of what I consider our staple crops, or the things that I get the most questions about, people seem to be the most interested in. And I'll kind of go over the summary and some of the basic results, and then we can talk about recommendations as well. And if anyone has questions as we go through crop by crop, Monica, you're welcome to jump in, and yeah, you're welcome to ask those, or we can hold them all to the end. I have a tendency to tangentialize on questions. So unless it's like a really burning question to clarify, maybe we can hold most questions till the end. Okay, so just a quick summary of what's been done. So since 2017, a total of 39 varieties of carrots have been tested or evaluated. 11 varieties have been evaluated consistently for 5 years. What does that mean? So this bar chart here that you see is those 11 varieties that have been tested or evaluated at the Fairbanks Experiment Station consistently for 5 years. And the reason we use that kind of body of data is to show what those yields, this is all yields per pound being represented here, but we're looking at yields over time. And so when we talk about variety trials or any kind of agricultural research, we often replicate our research. And so at the experiment station here in Fairbanks, I do replicate in triplicate. So there's usually 3 plots of every single variety, but we also replicate over each year so that we can get that seasonal variability represented in our yields as well. So back to sort of the summary of our findings here, there's no difference in yields, except for we did see a statistically significant difference in yields in Napoli. And there have been significant differences with regard to taste and storage ability. So you can see some of that here. We do at the following every harvest, well, I shouldn't say every, we try to make sure that we do a taste test, a blind taste test with a minimum of 4 people, anywhere up from 4 up to 20 people who have the privilege of getting to taste anywhere from, 5 to 20 different varieties of carrots. Ask them at the end whether or not they think it's a privilege or not. But these are the varieties: Napoli, Nectar, Mokum, New Cruda, and Carvel. There, you will notice that in some of these recommendations here, these are the ones that are new or have been added to the trials more recently. So not since that 2017 to 2022 trial period. And so I'll just mention too, I try and do a minimum of 3 years of trials for every single variety that I include into the trials. 5 years is a really good standard from an agricultural research experimental design perspective. And then we're constantly doing screening trials where I bring in new varieties, whether that be, I have a research partnership with Johnny Select Seed, for example, and they send me new seed that they're releasing to the market to test out up here periodically. So we get to try new things, and I'm constantly adding, especially if someone goes, hey, you've tested a lot of orange carrots, where are the purples and the yellows and the things like that? So in the last 2 years, we've added a lot more variety in as well. Okay, so yeah, you can see some good storage varieties there. And again, don't feel like you have to write everything down. We can definitely get you a copy of the slides. Okay, so in terms of that was 2017 to 2024 data. Here is, like I said, a sneak peek from our forthcoming report. So there's some varieties that are new to us this year. This list here is every variety that we trialed in 2024. Yeah, we grow a lot of carrots. And here are some of the varieties that these arrows indicate that they stood out to us for one reason or another. Usually the first thing that I'm looking at is yield. How successfully did they grow as compared to what we call a standard or a check crop. So in this case, Napoli is one of our standards for carrots in at least Fairbanks. And so we look at varieties that have either outperformed or consistently performed similarly to that. What you're not seeing in this table is it actually has many, many, many more columns. And we also do taste evaluation, pest resistance, bolt hardiness, vigor, disease resistance. All of those things are also included in our report. So keep an eye out for that if you're interested in some of those things in the future. But again, here you can see some of the varieties that I thought did really well, at least at first evaluation. So again, this was the first year a lot of these ones were trialed. Any carrot questions before we move on? Is this useful information to people? Are we happy with this kind of broad overview?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question.
Seeing a lot of nods. Oh, there's a question.
Does the data that you're going to produce, does it actually say what you were actually growing them in and what the conditions were?
Yeah.
Like dirt, yeah, whatever they might be, the variables.
Yeah, so these reports, they do have, it's not hugely extensive, and you're always welcome to reach out to me and ask more detailed questions, but we have an overview of weather on the next page. There is a detail of what our soil profile is, what we added for fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera. Everything that we're doing in these trials is grown in the ground. When I design these, I try to make them as straightforward as possible. I don't use techniques. I try to avoid techniques that are super specialty or high intensity so that the average person who's going to try and grow something in the ground can replicate it pretty easily. So yes, that information is generally included as well. Alrighty. So moving on to sweet corn. I don't know how much corn is grown down there in South Central. I know some people do grow it in high tunnels. We're seeing more and more success with sweet corn varieties in Fairbanks, but we have a lot more heat units than our friends south of the Alaska Range. So this may be meaningful to folks. The few things I will point out are well, I'll kind of start with what I think is important. So even in Fairbanks, when I'm conducting the trials, I do 2 replicates. One is in this plastic mulch, which is called infrared transmitting. What this is it's a wavelength selective mulch that helps warm the soil. So crops, warm living crops like corn and winter squash and tomatoes, they all have a 50-degree growing threshold. And our soils in Alaska are often hovering right around 50 degrees well into the summer. And so this just helps the plants actually start growing, to put it simply. So I've always conducted a trial side by side with corn both in the IRT and planted direct in soil. So we use a bed shaper. So the beds are just slightly raised above the aisle height here. And there's very rarely, there's a few varieties, and depending on the year, it usually has to be a nice warm year. Are we actually getting corn that is direct seeded into the ground, no IRT, that is reaching maturity? So corn is what I would still very much consider a variable or a marginal crop for Alaska. So take all of this with a grain of salt, but people, man, they're keen on their corn. So we talk about it. So again, 27 varieties have been tested to date. Only 11 varieties consistently over the past 4 years. Corn is another one of those crops that they're constantly coming out with new cultivars, which is another word that we use for varieties. It usually has to do with plant breeding. As you can see with our whisker plots here, there's a whole lot of variability in varieties depending on the season that we have. And so I try and look for the crops that have some of the least amount of variability, or excuse me, some of the varieties that have the least amount of variability in terms of making selections and recommendations. So you can kind of see the ones here with the shorter whisker plot. That just means that their yield means aren't all over the place. So some of the ones that I would recommend, especially up here in the interior, would be Sugar Pearl Espresso, Temptress, Cafe, Sugar Buns. Those all did really well up here. If you're in a cooler climate and maybe have a shorter season, Early V and Early Sunglow are 2 of the earliest maturing. And Fisher's Earliest, oh, my little triangle. Fisher's Earliest is another one that is a really, early to mature, so short days to maturity up here, and as is Quick Start. So when you look at the report, you can see how many days to maturity they are, and that can help you make decisions about what grows best in your growing conditions based on first and last frost dates. And then you can also consider when your temperatures get above a mean of 50 degrees for your daytime temperatures. So that's kind of a way to help make decisions about which varieties might be best for you. And then of course we provide yield data for plot, and then what you could expect, say, for a row foot and the average unit weight. So in this case, this would be each ear of corn. So in Palmer and South Central, like I said, we haven't done a lot of corn trials. I've done this 2 years, and 1 year we had a windstorm blow everything flat. And last year was kind of a cool, wet winter, or excuse me, summer. And so we got corn to grow fairly well in terms of mature ears. Sure could have used another week or 2 of 60 degrees or warmer. But I would say that these are some good recommendations to try, especially if you have a high tunnel. So I know for a lot of you down in South Central, you're in high tunnel central, and you might have that option. That being said, we have done all of our trials for corn outdoors. So these are all field tested in that RRT plastic. I've done a couple of guard plants in the high tunnel just to help create a wind block, and the corn is happy in there, but I'm not actually recording yield. So I would just say go for it and conduct your own trial if you're interested in growing corn, and tell me your results if you feel like it. All right, so
can I ask a question about the corn? Are you direct seeding all of it or transplanting?
Great question. Yeah, and I will do my best to remember to clarify that. So there's several crops that we are direct seeding and those that we are transplanting. So corn, we did a trial a couple years ago. actually we did 2 years of trials where we looked at corn. So we're transplanting it is the short answer. And we looked at starting corn 4 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, and 1 week before transplanting to look at which had the best results. The field was full of corn that year, but it was fine. And it appears that 2 weeks seems to be ideal, no more than 3. You want the corn to have set some nice healthy roots, but transplant shock, when you start to get root bound, is notable in corn. And the transplant shock seems to get pretty, it seems worse, at least up here in Fairbanks, anything after about 2 weeks. And 1 week, the plants were still pretty immature. You didn't have any leaf growth really yet, and they were pretty tender. So we had quite a bit of dying back when we had only 1 week old starts that we're transplanting in. Did I answer the question sufficiently? And I'll do my best to remember to mention transplanting and dates. So beans are a direct seeded crop. We actually didn't do beans over the last 2 years, mostly because beans to trial are a really time intensive crop. You have to harvest them a minimum of twice a week, oftentimes 3 times a week, in order to ensure that you're not losing bean pods to moldy or over maturity or anything like that. So there's quite a few varieties that we have trialed that aren't represented in slides here, but again, they'll be in those reports. And you can check those out because there's been 19 trialed, and here of the 5 that are represented, only 4 are still commercially available in terms of your ability to get seed from different seed companies. So beans are pretty straightforward in Alaska. I feel like everywhere has their tips and tricks for growing them. Oftentimes in wet, rainy years, which is much of a south central summer, it's really tough to keep the plants from having mold issues. And so using low covers, staking them up, things like that can increase your yields. And then I have personally really liked rock door. I think it's much better flavor and texture and overall just better eating quality than Provider, which Provider and Contender are sort of our 2 standard or check crops, or excuse me, varieties for Alaska. So if you like Provider or Contender, you get just a little bit less, but this nice yellow bean here is rock door, and I think that it actually cans up a lot better too. For those who are interested in making like dilly beans, it keeps its texture a little bit better. All right, so moving right along, and I'm sorry that I'm kind of whizzing through these. There's like 30 some slides and a whole lot of crops to get through, so that's why I said there will be slides available at the end. I just want to give you guys sort of an overview of what we've grown and what does well, and we can hopefully have some time for questions at the end. So celery, similarly, haven't grown celery in the last 2 years, and that's mostly because there's actually not a lot of celery varieties on the market. There are a couple more heirloom ones, but I didn't mention this at the beginning, I don't think, but one of the things that I do focus on in the trials is evaluating seed that is readily available. So people are like, well, what does that mean? And it means that you can go online usually or to a seed catalog and you can find the seed available to you. So I have evaluated some heirloom varieties. I don't necessarily disclude them from the trials, but I am looking for varieties that you could say go to Baker Creek Rare Seeds and get a quantity available enough to plant any year versus having to, have a personal relationship with a seed library in Oklahoma or something like that. So what that means for celery is we evaluated a total of 9 varieties, and that sort of exhausted the market. And we did that for 4 years and had really consistent results, no significant differences in yield, although some really stood out. I personally think that Marengo and Tango are lovely varieties. You get these nice thick stalks. They're much less stringy and they have kind of a sweet quality to them. I do understand, though, that celery has different characteristics depending on where it's grown. In the summers, we have really hot temperatures. They do get more stringy. You have more hollow stalk. They tend to be a little bit more bitter. So environmental factors do matter, right? And then the one thing I have people ask me a lot about celery is, well, why are mine so spindly and you have these nice fat stalks? Water. Water is the answer. A lot of people, especially up here in Fairbanks, who have holding tanks or they do catchment for their gardens, and then we have a lot more heat. Oftentimes we're just underwatering our gardens, and I am included in that because I lived in dry cabins for most of my life. So yeah, the answer is often water. All right, moving right along to beets. So beets are near and dear to our heart here in Alaska, or at least they were to my community growing up. So we've tested a total of 22 varieties of beets since 2017. And in the last few years, we started adding more color variety into the beets. So everything that's represented here is a red beet. So this, for those of you who are maybe interested in a gold beet or some of these other specialty colors, you might not be as interested in this, but look again to those trial reports for other years, 2022, 3, and 4, when they are back available online. In terms of varieties that I like, these 4 varieties here I included because I would recommend them to anyone to try out. I think that they're all great yield, great producers, have high yield, good upright foliage, and in the case of the Boro, Zeppo, and Sabetto, those are an Italian varieties or crosses, and they have pretty nice salad greens too for people who like beet tops as well. And then again, Sabetto, Robin, and Boro, so 2 of those Italian F1s were rated best in blind taste tests, and I personally love this Boldor beet, and these 2 roasted, like, ugh, just do it. Yeah, if anyone's yeah, anyway, I guess that's beets, unless anyone has any other questions. Okay, so tomatoes are fairly new to the trials. I really resisted tomatoes for a long time because there are so many. So opposite end of the spectrum to celery, where there's, a total of 5 or 6 different varieties to evaluate, or seed varieties to evaluate any given time. There are thousands of tomato varieties, and part of that is because tomato seed is fairly easy to keep, and tomatoes are fairly easy to cross and create new varieties. So we see more and more of them on the market every year, especially when we are breeding for different disease or pest resistance. And similarly, because they're easy to breed, they're easy to save and create heirloom varieties or maintain heirloom varieties. So lots and lots of tomatoes out there. This list is in no way exhaustive. This is just the varieties that we evaluated in 2024. In 2023, that was our first year, and there's some varieties that aren't on here. In 23, I worked pretty closely with our seed library up here in Fairbanks, so the Saving Esther's Biodiversity Seed Library at the John Trigg Library, if anyone's familiar. I grew out a lot of their tomato varieties that they had in the library that they needed to refresh some seed for, and that we wanted to compare to some newly released varieties to see if some of these varieties that we're holding on to were in fact any more hardy or resilient or early to some of the varieties that had traditionally been saved and grown here in Fairbanks. So that's a bit of a sidebar. I'm not going to get into the details on that. There are a few varieties from that collection, like the Cosmonaut Volkov, which is commercially available and has been saved in that collection. And there's quite a few from Ukraine and Russia and other northern countries that are not represented here, again, because it is pretty difficult to get that seed. So that sidebar covered. These red arrows represent varieties that performed really well in 2024. And then, as I've indicated up here, we do replicate the tomato trials both inside and outside the high tunnel. What we found just from doing a cursory review of the data was that yields were typically 2 to 2 to 4 times higher when grown inside the high tunnel as opposed to field grown. So that would be something that we expect, but it's nice to have some baseline data on that. There were a few varieties like the Bartelli, so that's this cherry tomato here, and Mountain Princess, which are fairly new varieties developed by Johnny Seed. And I should also preface with, in no way do I am I trying to make brand recommendations. That's just where the seed came from. And I do have a research MOU with Johnny's, so I do mention them probably more than any other, but it's not because I am promoting one over another. Anyway, these two did perform pretty similarly, both in a high tunnel setting and the field. And so tomato recommendations, I get this question a lot. So I put together this little list. And again, this is just from 2023 and 24. 2023 was a pretty rainy, cool year, and 2024 started out really strong, and then we got really wet and cool at the end. So I would imagine with future years of tomato evaluation that we'll probably see some differences, and I might have a different list of recommendations after a few more years of trialing. But especially for those of you with high tunnels, these ones are all varieties that have been selected for their cool weather tolerance, disease tolerance, and then are also usually determinate or semi-determinate and have early days to maturity. So short season, cold, hardy varieties here. And these, just for people who are interested, this is a new variety from High Mowing. So it's an organic cherry. This is the Toranjana, and it is a organic improvement on Sun Gold. So for those of you who are familiar with the much loved and coveted Sun Gold variety, this one did pretty well for us. It outperformed in terms of yield and leaf curling due to cold. So due to environmental conditions up here, it was cold. This plant was a little bit hardier than the Sun Gold, even though I still think Sun Gold is a slightly better eating quality tomato. Okay, spinach. Like I said, we're racing through our vegetables here. So the spinach study was the spinach is a little bit different than some of the other crops. We are primarily conducting spinach trials to evaluate for bolt hardiness. Some people might also know this as field holding capacity. And so what I'm talking about here is trying to identify the varieties that don't do this to us. So it doesn't mean that the spinach is necessarily inedible, but once our spinach starts to bolt, it gets a lot more bitter. And also, you just oftentimes, especially the further north you go, so the longer the photo period, the faster spinach will take off on us like this. So trying to identify those that have best field holding capacity. And I know too, for a lot of folks, they're looking at spinach from the perspective of a baby leaf spinach, and that again is not the focus of the study. We're again working with seed companies, and so they're really interested in that bolt hardiness, and so that's what we're evaluating for. So I don't have anything for you on yields, but I do have some information in terms of those that were the slowest to bolt. So Escalade, that's this variety that you see here. Renegade is one of my favorites. Space is actually one of our checks or our standards for Alaska, so it's nice to see that that holds up for us. And then there's some other varieties that did relatively well. And down in South Central Alaska, you might try some of these varieties. They performed fairly well, though they were a little faster to bolt. And I'll say that Oceanside and Seaside is a second or two of the best, in my personal opinion, best tasting spinach I've ever had. So sweeter, nuttier, had a really nice leaf texture, didn't leave that bitter taste and texture on the tongue. So give those a shot if you're interested in some spinach, any of those. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about replicated trials. So I mentioned this at the beginning, that all trials we try to replicate in, so the plot is the space that we grow, say, 24 carrots in. And then we replicate that 3 times throughout the field so that we can try to identify if there's any differences due to soil homogeneity or fertilizer differences in terms of, our areas of higher soil fertility or anything like that. And then a lot of what we end up doing, because it takes up a lot of space, a lot of time, so it's resource intensive is another way of putting it, to do those replicated trials. In order to decide what to put into replicated trials, I often do what are called screening trials. And this is where we just look at evaluating a high number of crops and cultivars within those crop families to really try and identify as many varieties as possible. I included some teasers on this slide, which you may or may not thank me for. We did do French or muskmelons one year, and these are like one of the 2 mature melons we have of each of those plants. So here's some varieties that actually did give us some mature fruit, but that screening trial has been cut and I don't include any more information about melons in this. So for those of you with high tunnels and a slightly warmer climate down there in the Alaska banana belt, yeah, you could try quite a few more melon varieties than we have, but we decided to move along in terms of trials for those. All right, so winter squash. Winter squash are near and dear to my heart. That's sort of one of my pet favorites, I guess, for trials. We have looked at around 30 different winter squash varieties. So all 3 families, the Machada, Maxima, and Pepo, or Pepo, as some people say. And what's represented here again is just sort of a selection of some of the ones that I would recommend trying and some of the favorites. And if it has a little red asterisk next to it, these are ones that when people ask me what should I start with, like what's an easy entryway variety to get into, these are some of the ones that I recommend just because of their, again, success over multiple years. Some people don't love spaghetti squash, but spaghetti squash does really, really well up here in Fairbanks and has done fairly well down in South Central as well. And then sweet mama is a nice kabocha, and red curry is a mini red Hubbard. Those have both done really nicely in both locations as well. And as you can see up here in Fairbanks, where it's a little bit warmer, we can grow the heck out of some squash. And maybe I should say more about why I like squash. So when we think about, again, I said my background was in food systems. So when we think about foods that are nutrition dense, they have a long storage or shelf life, and they also are in their own packaging. So we don't have to worry about, like processing it and packaging it, right? You can just have something on the shelf that gets you into December or even this time of year in the right growing condition, or excuse me, storage conditions. Pumpkins are relatively new to the trials. So these are all Cucurbita pepo. And we started doing pumpkins actually in response to this gal here. She at 13, if any of you know Lorinda Lotka, she works for DEC and has been a colleague on the Alaska Food Policy Council for quite a few years, but her daughter Lucy here approached me when she was 13 years old to start her own trials at her house. She wanted to do pumpkin trials, and when she turned 15, which is the minimum to work for the university, she started on as a variety trial research technician. And so we do the pumpkin trials in Lucy's honor. And these are the ones that we've done in the last 2 years since she's been working for us. You can thank Lucy for the pumpkin. In terms of eating pumpkins, I'd recommend some people call it the New England long pie, others just refer to it as long pie. These are excellent. Cinnamon Girl is fairly good, but we had some issues with mold on those, and they've only been trialed 1 year, so I can't really say if they are one that I would recommend for a damp or wetter growing conditions. And then in terms of a jack-o'-lantern, Renegade did really nicely for us, and this is a Renegade. That's a nice good sized pumpkin there.
Okay.
All right. I can pause for a second. Are there any questions about pumpkin squash or any, oops, excuse me, any of the other varieties that I've whizzed past. People interested in. Okay.
Anything here? I'll watch the chat though. and let
All
you
right,
know.
sounds good. And yeah, we can have more of a discussion afterwards. Trying to keep an eye on the time. Okay, so hot peppers, again, fairly new to the trials. 2021 was the first year that I included any hot peppers into the trial, and those were all field grown. In 2023 and 24, we replicated trials into the high tunnels. So we've looked at about, I think it's 9 or so varieties, both in and outside of the high tunnel environment. Some of them that I would recommend for anyone who's just interested in getting an introduction to hot peppers, this Black Magic jalapeno. That's really nice, early, productive, and I think it's got one of the better taste and texture profiles. I will say, just word of caution, peppers don't actually get that hot here in Alaska. We can usually do a field bite test, which just means we pull it off the plant and take a bite of almost every single pepper that we grow, even some of the hotter ones like our cayennes, because we just don't have the growing degrees or the heat units to really develop those capsicum, oh gosh, the flavonoids that make peppers hot. Anyway, so we can grow some really nice peppers, as you can see here. The red ember was probably one of the nicest hotter peppers that we grew. I think this is a Santa Fe pepper, and we grew a Serrano too, which I don't think is on this list. But again, everything is in the reports that had some nice heat to them. And then last year was 2023 was the first year that we started including sweet peppers in the trials as well. We've had mixed luck with sweet peppers, but some of the ones that I'm really excited about are these Cornito, the series. So these are out of High Mowing. There's a red, orange, and yellow. And those are all super early days to maturity, and we actually had pretty good yield for those. Sailfish, this was not from our field. This is from the seed catalog. We had like 1.5 ripe peppers on the plant at any given time. So this is ambitious, but they did really well, and they did exceptionally well in the high tunnel, whereas most other varieties of peppers, interestingly enough, did better actually in the field, planted within IRT plastic rows, as opposed to in high tunnels. So that's something we'll continue to look at in the future and see if that trend, in fact, carries on. All right, leeks, really quickly here. Again, not too many leek varieties to trial, so we probably won't do leeks again in the future, but the one that has stood out year after year to me is Chinook. This triangle here is my way of representing probably a good pick for South Central. These did really well in Palmer, as did the King Richard and Lancelot. I call them the Night Sweet, but they have an actual name. But anyway, these are the a couple of other varieties that you could check out if you'd like. They didn't have as many issues with heat blowout as like the Zermatt and Lincoln did here. But again, if you're gonna try a leek, I would go for Chinook. All right, broccoli. We brought broccoli trials back in 2024, and we haven't trialed broccoli since 2017, so I actually don't have very much data on broccoli at all. But I can say now that there's some new varieties coming out. There's some that stood out to me. Bellstar did really, really well for us, as did Eastern Magic. And what I liked about this is I actually had some consistency between the variety that did well in Fairbanks and in Palmer. So that's what the triangle represents. And another variety that did a little bit better down in South Central was Amadeus, as opposed to Fairbanks. So check some of those out if you are interested in growing broccoli. And people often ask, why don't you do more brassicas? And the answer is moose fencing. So limited resources. Same goes for cauliflower. So 2024 was the first year of doing cauliflower for quite some time. I was blown away with this variety. This is from Baker Creek. As you can see here, hands for reference. These are massive heads of cauliflower. I thought they had excellent roasting quality. They weren't as packed of a curd. And so I thought they just roasted up really nice. And then Bremio did really well, and Skywalker as well in terms of kind of classic cauliflower, so big bright white curd. And this was the first year this new white Romanesco, so the spiralized cauliflower, was on the market. And it did really, really well both up here, and it did fairly well in Palmer. And I thought that it had excellent eating quality. So I'm excited to give that one a try again, whether it's in the trials or my home garden. So highly recommend if anyone's interested in trying out something kind of fun and new, especially if you're doing like a CSA box or something like that. I think things like this stand out when you have some specialty varieties to include. And then of the purple varieties that I've tested in the past, this variety, Purple Moon, is fairly standard and did really well for us this year and had pretty good eating quality. So if anyone's interested again in a specialty variety. Artichokes, we didn't do artichokes last year. Again, there's not lots and lots of varieties in terms of what's commercially available. There's lots from different like home breeding and heirloom programs for artichokes. The one that stood out, the variety that stood out across all 3 years of trials was Taver. It also hands down beat all of the others in flavor and so taste tests. And this Colorado Star is again an attractive variety, so specialty, but it had more deformity issues than some of the other varieties that we tested. And it grows, I don't think you can quite see it in this, this picture might not be a high enough resolution, but the claws, we call them cat claws on the ends of these things, they were kind of lethal to harvest. So they were a little bit unpleasant to work with. Not that artichokes are like a cuddly, friendly crop anyway. They make a pretty good pest fence if you really want to put in a living fence of some kind. And I also would be interested because we watched some of these varieties go through a number of different frost cycles. For those of you who are further south, I would recommend even trying Taver as a perennial. As many of you might know who are familiar with artichokes, people grow artichokes perennially down in the Pacific Northwest, or they can. And I might try this variety if someone was willing to give that a shot. Okay. Oh gosh, getting really close on time. Asparagus. We started an asparagus trial in 2022. For those of you who aren't familiar with asparagus, it's a perennial crop, and it's typically a minimum of 3 years before you start harvesting it. So harvesting it for eating. We have done some field bite tests. So when we have some of these nice spring shoots come up, we didn't harvest anything for the first year. The second year, when we started getting, you can kind of see here, we have like 5 or 6 different shoots coming up. So we weren't harvesting them. We were letting them grow into full fronds here so that they could put that energy, photosynthesize and put that energy back down into the root crowns. And next year is the first year that we'll start collecting data on yield. So I'm very excited for that. And then last year, so 2024, we installed a much larger replicated asparagus trial at both the experiment station here and at a farm that I'm working closely with on another project where we're looking at the interactions between permafrost degradation and agriculture. And so we're looking at asparagus as a cold soil, I guess, option for someone who's got permafrost present in their field. And so we'll have some nice side-by-side comparisons for that in another 2 or 3 years. But we are looking at survivability rates here. So all of these varieties, we planted crowns, so not from seed, but crowns. I did do a little experiment this year and I got some purple passion seed and I planted that in the spring. I think we started it in early March and planted it out in the field. And I'll do a survivability evaluation of that this coming spring. But their germination rate was great. They were healthy plants when we planted them and all through the summer. So fingers crossed that will result in some nice plants, because I just learned last year that this Jersey series is actually being discontinued. So if anyone's interested in asparagus, I would recommend trying to find crowns. You can order usually 1 to 2 year old crowns like this and have them shipped to you in the spring. I'd recommend trying to find those now, since those are nice and hardy and have done pretty well in trials here. And then there's a few more varieties that I started to collect recommendations on, and we'll try and include into future trials coming out of the Pacific Northwest. And I'll have to think for a sec, but I can get you the names of those varieties if you're interested. But we might be having to do more asparagus from seed is the short summary there. I think this is the last crop that I've got to go over. So garlic, we started some garlic trials in 2022 and have a total of 27 varieties that we've evaluated to date. This year I'm super excited because I'm working with a small garlic producer out of Central Oregon, South Central Oregon, and he's actually been breeding new varieties. So with garlic, we're doing we're doing clonal propagation. We're taking cloves and we're putting them in the ground and letting the new bulb grow from there. And instead, this fellow is actually he's painstakingly figured out how to save true seed and cross different garlic varieties. So he's got some 2 and 3, maybe even 4th generation crosses now, and we've planted some of those in a trial this fall, and we'll see how those do. That being said, some of the standards for people who are interested in planting garlic and they want a guaranteed something for their effort, music continues to be one of our highest yielding, similarly with Chestnut Red, and Montana Giant has had some variability from year to year. So it did really well in 2022. Our harvest in 24, so we planted in 23 and harvested it in 24, wasn't as great. And then North with an E is a variety that was relatively new to me in 2022, excuse me. We planted in 22, and so the harvest for 23 and 24 were both fairly good, and it's just a really hardy, very green, upright plant. So the high vigor gives me hope that it's nicely adapted for Alaska. So that, in a nutshell, is a review of some of our crops. For those of you who want more information and those annual variety trial reports, here's the long form website. Again, if you just Google UAF variety trials, it'll get you to the same place, probably quicker. And we also have information. I do some little videos on YouTube. We're hoping to do some more of those this year. Similarly, our communications department helps me push out some information about the trials in season. I'll say I used to be a lot better about this when I didn't have so many plates I was spinning. So we don't have as many variety trial updates, but I try to get things like this where there's some information content as well as some photos periodically through the UAF Extension Instagram. For those of you down in South Central, periodically the Matanuska Experiment Station Facebook posts information about variety trials. Again, they don't have a dedicated communication staff person at this time, so I don't know how much is really going to make it on there, but this is just a good resource anyway. Check out what's going on down there. And there's my contact information, and shout out that, like, for people who are interested in maybe a summer experience in Fairbanks or looking for a job, we are hiring. So I've got a crew lead research technician, which is full-time, and then this pool just hasn't been released yet, but it's for a seasonal technician to help on the variety trials. So if you or anyone you know is interested in getting your hands in the soil and playing with a whole lot of different vegetables, yeah, feel free to get in touch with me here or check out the posting. And with that, oh my gosh, I just made it under an hour, but I'm happy to stick around and chat if people have questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Glenna.
Good job.
Yeah, there were a couple questions that popped up in the chat. And when you were talking about winter squash, somebody asked about if you tested any acorn squash.
Yeah,
And
yeah, we have. So this is always where the real test for me comes, is if I can remember off the top of my head. So acorn squash that have done well for us, and again, this is primarily in Fairbanks, but night shift has been a really good one. And then I was impressed last night, or not last night, I was impressed this last year with one called Starry Night. So that's a mottled skin. It's named after the painting because it kind of looks like swirled green and gold patterns on the, yeah.
What was the name of the first one she mentioned?
Yes, there's, so Night Shift is like classic, really dark green. And we've tested some other varieties as well, but to me, those are the two that have had the highest yield and the least amount of loss. So
Thank you.
things like mold or
Have you
unfortunately.
ever tried sweetmeat, the winter squash?
Yeah, yep, we have.
The results?
You'd have to look back at the report to
Oh,
see how it
okay.
compares to the others. Yeah. I don't keep like yield per pound or pounds per plot scrolled away in my head as much as I'd love to. I recall it being what I would consider a average to good producer.
then how early did you start peppers?
Great question. So peppers, and maybe I can even give you accurate information versus so for peppers, we are starting those in usually in April. Yeah, so April 12th is pretty typical, and I would say that a lot of our peppers we could start a little bit earlier than that. Our issue up here tends to be space management. So I'm often doing a balancing act of if I'll have enough space to up pot things. So some strategy goes into that. But somewhere mid-April.
Did you have any bugs with the peppers outside?
We've had some issues with aphids from year to year, but not too bad. I get a lot of questions about pests, and there's a few that I identify, and I have like we know when we have a slug problem, we know when we have an aphid problem or thrips or things like that. But I'm not an entomologist, so I rely on my friends in the IPM department, that's Integrated Pest Management, to help me out. And sometimes I can never identify what the actual issue is. And so we use a horticultural neem oil, and we'll treat with that a couple times if we have issues that I can't resolve. But peppers have been pretty pest free up here for us.
Thank you.
The start date on peppers, would you say it's the same up in Fairbanks as it would be down in South Central?
Probably, having not trialed the peppers in Palmer, I don't actually have a great reference to tell you one way or another. I always base our plant out date June 1st, and oftentimes we're getting into the field sometime between May 22nd and June 7th on a crazy year. So I would say if that's your similar window, then that's probably your similar start date. But if you're getting into the field much earlier than that, I would bump it up that many days sooner. I know our friends at Calypso Farm and Ecology Center start their peppers more like the first week of April. And they have larger, more robust peppers going into the season. And that would be another way, if you have the space and you have the environment to start something like peppers, you could certainly increase your yield just because you'd have a more mature plant going into the height of summer. So if you've got the space, yeah. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
If you're in Fairbanks, can you see any of the trials? I've seen the botanical gardens, but not for the trials.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I'll say the answer is mixed. I am happy to try and accommodate specialty viewings if I can, but the majority of the trials are located in the research fields. So that's not open to public access at the experiment station. That being said, I do try and have some demonstration plots up in the botanical garden going at all times. The problem is there's really limited space in the botanical garden. So of course I don't have everything that I'm trialing up in the botanical garden. It's usually a very small subset, and it's usually whatever we had extra of when we finished planting in the field, trying to do some demo plots up there. So the other time that the one time of the year that we are open to general viewing is we've brought back field days. And so this year that open field day was July 30th, and down at the Palmer station, I believe it was a few days later. So right there at the end of July. And so if you happen to be coming up to Fairbanks and you have a flexible schedule, check out the when the AFES field days might be, and that's a good way to ensure you can kind of see behind the curtain.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything over in Saldovia? All right.
Well, I
Any last-
appreciate everyone.
Yeah, just a quick, I put it in the chat and maybe I just missed it, but that mulch, that plastic mulch that you mentioned, what was that
Mhm.
called and where do you get it?
Yeah, great question. So that's IRT is sort of the okay, so infrared transmitting is the action of the mulch. So if you look up IRT mulch, you'll find a couple of different sellers. I believe on Johnny's or Harris has it listed under solar mulch. But you just want to make sure that it's infrared transmitting. So IRT is how you would search it. And there's quite a few different vendors that you could get it from. What usually makes the decision for me is the cost of shipping to Alaska. And I will also just put in a plug for my next talk for Know Your Land. I'll actually be talking in depth about the different mulches that we use in trials up here in Fairbanks. So we've got 11 different mulch types, everything from biodegradable to plastic to organic mulches. So that would be like straw and deep compost versus several different plastic cultures versus some of the new to market biodegradable plastics. And so we're looking at those. I mentioned the permafrost grown project that I have going with some colleagues up here. So we're looking at the thermal impact of these different mulches on soils, primarily to evaluate how that might affect ice-rich soil. But we're also looking at yield and weed suppression activity and biodegradability for those that are biodegradable. So if you're interested in mulch and generally season extension or soil warming techniques, that presentation, I believe, is March 6th. If I've got,
Just
yep.
double check that.
Okay,
website.
cool. And I'm gonna try and come down for that. I can't make any promises, but I'm gonna try to come down and see my in-laws and Kenai and may hang out with y'all.
Yay.
Well, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Hey, well, thanks for having me. It was nice to see the little vignettes of your faces. And like I said before, please get in touch if you have any questions. Email is the best way to reach me, and I do try and respond quickly. I know people always have questions about variety selection this time